Samson, let me put you on the spot. Did the political parties do enough to resist this perfidy in the name of this Electoral Act 2026? Did they do enough?
Quite frankly, I don't think they did enough. I think the political parties should feel ashamed. In the entire reform process, it was just civil society. There are wrecks that we know wrecked elections in 2023. They have taken them back to those states. Why were they deployed back to those states? These kinds of developments does not inspire confidence. I can say the wreck for Rivers is one, right? Look at the wreck that managed the Edo elections, and look at what happened in the Edo elections. How come he was deployed to Akwa Ibom? The Akwa Ibom that we know very well, its own electoral history. I see no reason why in section 63 you say the only time INEC can activate its power to review results declared under duress or in contravention of the procedure established in the law is only when an INEC official files a report. What if that INEC official is the one who is complicit? Because if you say an INEC official is the only one that must file a report before you review, then you clearly know that this entire system has been set up to deliver a particular outcome.
This is Naija Unfiltered on SYMFONI TV. My name is Olawale Oluwade. And my guest today is Barrister Samson Itodo, Executive Director of Yiaga Africa, Nigeria's leading civil society organization on electoral matters. Mr. Samson, welcome to SYMFONI TV.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Let's get right into our conversation. Primaries of political parties have been going on. From the APC primaries, which was concluded over the weekend, videos circulating online showed in a couple of, more than a couple actually, counting, jumping from arithmetic counting to geometric or exponential counting, 100 and then suddenly 500 to 10,000 to whatever. The question is, did Yiaga Africa monitor any of these primaries? And what's your conclusion on this?
Well, Yiaga Africa did monitor the primaries through our partners. We also worked with other organizations that monitored these primaries across board. And our take, looking at all the primaries, at least most of the ones conducted by the parties, is that some of them are actually a travesty of electoral democracy. Like you referenced, this geometric counting is just the most criminal and unfortunate and a dark tale of our electoral process. It is just unacceptable that in broad daylight, that political parties are instrumentalizing the innocence of citizens and are exploiting the entire machinery for candidate nomination just to impose candidates. What we saw is it's unfortunate, but it really tells you how our political actors are preparing for the next elections. They are not ready in any way to play by the rules. They want to secure power at all costs. And that was a manifestation of what we saw. And I just hope that they recognize that Nigerians cannot be deceived, that what we do is we damage our reputation. We question our own moral rules as a society. And what happened is just a reinforcement of the absence of red lines in our society. And any society that has no red lines that should not be crossed, it's really a society that is heading towards what you call the Hobbesian state of affairs.
These are heavy words. Even your opening remarks, they are very sobering. And you touched on something that is so profound, deeply profound and worrying for somebody like myself. Because when you see government officials criticize those of us in the media space, political analysts, and say what we're doing is we're demarketing the country before the international, in the global world. What just transpired in the name of democracy, counting in such a bizarre manner? Does anything demarket Nigeria more than that? Samson?
Absolutely. When you're looking for the best case scenario of not just demarketing the country, but really, damaging our sensibilities, it's this act by the political class. Why complain about the media? Media is performing its role by being the vanguard of society. But if a political party cannot count, its members who are exercising a democratic right, and you see this sort of the whole concept of geometric counting just really tells you the moral fiber of our political class. And I dare say that what has transpired in these primaries really puts Nigeria's integrity to question. How do you manage your affairs in that manner, and you expect people to trust you, and you expect people to engage with you? Because they clearly know that you don't have any set of values. There's no modicum of values, because if we're a value-based and a value-driven society, then that which happened in these primaries should have been condemned. But unfortunately, we have seen, even political senior and top political leaders actually delegitimizing an illegality, and it speaks to nothing, not just to their conscience, but to the fact that they have absolute disregard for the values of integrity, transparency, and accountability. And I don't know what on earth these people are doing in the public space, because a public office is held in trust for the people. Nigerians don't trust their political leaders because the political leaders continue to rob them of the opportunity, continue to lie to them, and continue to force this illegality, down their throats. And I just hope that as a country, we don't come to a point where we accept this as the norm. And that's what the politicians want us to do. And I think this time calls for men and women, young people of good conscience, to actually rise and push back on these dictatorial and authoritarian tendencies that we see manifest, whether in the form of captured candidate nomination process or imposition of candidates during elections.
In a specific case, in Bende local government of Abia State, where incidentally the deputy speaker of the House of Representatives was holding the flag of, not the flag, a banner of the president's image, and then they began counting. An INEC official was standing right there when this counting, and something perhaps more than myself, the Electoral Act 2026 as amended mandates INEC to observe all of these party processes.
Yep.
So while INEC official was there, and this perfidy, transpired, and is acceptable, can you speak to this, please? That INEC was present, INEC official was present there.
Well, I think that the procedure requires that INEC monitors the primaries, and then INEC writes its report. My understanding is that at the end of this process, those who went to the field to monitor the primaries will report to the commission what they observed and what they monitored. And the commission would, on the basis of that, take its decision. It is clear that there were flagrant disregard for the Electoral Act and for INEC's regulations and guidelines. It is also clear that in the management of the counting of those who participated in direct primaries, that it was manipulated, it was falsified, and to every extent, it was just an aberration. And when INEC received that, we hope to see what INEC will do with this report. Because quite frankly, if INEC were to implement the Electoral Act, and I see no reason why they shouldn't, if they were to also implement and enforce their regulations and guidelines, then some of these primaries will definitely not stand the test. And I hope that INEC is transparent enough to communicate to Nigerians that, yes, we deployed monitors to the field, this was what we saw, and based on their observation and monitoring, these parties did not meet the test in the conduct of their primaries. And INEC needs to be bold and courageous, because these times call for courageous institutions that can look at, political actors in the face and say, this is unacceptable. That is why the Constitution vests powers on INEC as an independent umpire to regulate the character of our political class. And so we expect that INEC will instrumentalize, its powers and really call these primaries for what it is.
Brilliant. The Electoral Act, again, 2026 as amended, also requires parties, political parties, to submit their delegates list, their membership list to INEC. And it is expected that the reason why INEC is required to have that is also to audit it to be sure it's verifiable. Yeah. The numbers are, if you claim you have X number, INEC as a regulatory body must be able to verify those numbers. Now, after these primaries, I'm referring to the APC now, their chairman came up on Monday, if I'm not mistaken, to thump the party that, we have, the president got 10.99 votes, in inverted commas, I said votes in inverted commas, from these primaries. That was the total votes the president got, which is already over 2 million above what he got in the general elections in 2023. Before, Nigerians were saying, what's going on here? And then some began to make allusion that that's a pretext to the playbook of what's going to happen in 2027. Did INEC verify this figure? Have they audited the figure? I mean, an official of INEC came up, I think yesterday, to say, we don't know what that person is talking about. Can you speak to this?
Yes, parties were to submit registers to the Electoral Commission. INEC issued a statement that parties had complied. What we expected was INEC should publish those registers. INEC should do what we call deduplication to check some level of consistency and accuracies, but to also prevent, instances where you have names of members of parties appearing in multiple registers. Those are things that we thought that the commission will do, but the commission hasn't done that. But I think in this particular instant case, INEC should release the register of the parties, because the voters' register is released by INEC. It's a public document. So I see no reason why, the register of political parties should also not be accessible, so that people can actually query and raise objections where necessary. Because as you see, in the last couple of days, we've seen registered members of the ruling party who were either denied the ticket and have now emerged as party candidates in other political parties. And you just wonder what is really happening here, because the law is very clear that once the register is submitted, to INEC, that register is the only register that will be used for the primaries. So how come you now have individuals defecting and securing nomination of other political parties? Which register did those political parties actually use for the primary process? So I think that we're going to be seeing a flurry of litigations, but I think in this particular case, we have fundamental questions that need to be asked, whether these particular provisions of our Electoral Act have been enforced, and to what extent this complies with the principles of transparency, of accountability. And those are very tough questions. And I think every stakeholder, particularly INEC and the political parties, will really need to give account on how they have upheld provisions of the Electoral Act that were first introduced to sanitize the party nomination process, but also strengthen internal democracy in our parties.
You touched on something very, very important, which is the Electoral Act, 2026, closing the space, as it were, for candidates who have participated in the primary on one party, on one political party, suddenly moving to another party, haven't lost out here, moving to another party. But I thought the import of the recent judgment obtained by the youth party that went to court, and the court said, no, INEC, your guidelines are in flagrant breach of the Electoral Act. So you cannot you cannot constrict the space. I need you to shed more light on what you just said about, these candidates moving, as it were, the fluid system. Can you shed more light on it?
I think that the point about defections during party primaries have been a permanent feature, of our democratic process. And so there was an attempt, by the current National Assembly to amend the act and criminalize dual membership of political parties. Now, that only passed in the House of Reps. The Senate has not passed that particular legislation. So it still maintains an inchoate status, and so it cannot be implemented. Therefore, there aren't express provisions in our laws that criminalize dual membership of political parties. But I think morally and ethically, it's wrong. And there are perhaps provisions that could be interpreted, and you can draw inferences that they prevent, membership of two political parties. But when you look at the judgment issued by Justice Umar on the Youth Party versus INEC case, coupled with Justice Omotosho's recent ruling, I think there are a few things that actually come to the fore, and the public really needs to understand this. That first, that political parties have a right to ventilate their views in court. And so the fact that the Youth Party went to court to challenge some of this INEC's action, I think it's a positive development in our democratic process. The second point is that in our jurisprudence, it is established that INEC's independence is guaranteed by the Constitution. And INEC has a responsibility of issuing regulations and guidelines. The timetable of elections all fall within the constitutional competence of INEC. So INEC has that power. But also the Constitution vests INEC with discretionary powers. And those discretionary powers must be exercised in conformity with provisions of the Constitution and the Electoral Act. Section 70 of the Electoral Act gives INEC the power to issue guidelines and regulations. The guidelines and regulations are part of the electoral legal framework. However, they must not be inconsistent with provisions of the Act. What Section 129 says, it's that the submission of list of candidates shall occur not later than 120 days. But the law does not say not earlier than, because when it says that, it provides the time frame. And so INEC must work within the time frame. Now, based on our own jurisprudence, INEC is given the discretion, to determine, the earliest date in such a way that it takes care of certain activities that must happen before the final list is submitted. The first thing that must happen is that parties must obtain forms from INEC. They must then issue dates, notices to INEC, which is 21 days. After the primaries, the law provides that INEC will publish the list of the candidates 21 days after the list has been submitted to INEC. If you look at 21 days, that's about 3 weeks. Now, members of political parties, the public, can issue queries, because what INEC will do across its offices is to publish the particulars, and that's the credentials of those candidates that have been nominated by political parties. When you look at all these activities, they have to be taken into consideration before the date of before the final date, because the final date that was provided is 120 days. Now, here is it. In exercising discretion, those powers must be exercised in a way that it doesn't shrink the space, but encourages democratic participation. And I think in this instant case, what INEC should have done in the development of the timetable was to keep 3 things at the back of its mind. That one, in the 2026 Electoral Act, timelines were already compressed. And I've said this repeatedly, that the National Assembly had no business altering those timelines, because it wasn't part of the reform agenda in the first place. It was out of their selfish reasons that they altered those timelines. And so the timelines became compressed. That's one. 2, after the act was passed, the timetable that was issued was revised on the basis of religious observances that do what? Conflict with what? With the date already set for elections. And then now you have compressed timelines. Now you have a new Electoral Act. Reason expects that INEC and political parties would have sat down together to say, these are the issues. Can we explore timelines that will work for everybody? Because my view is that primaries could still hold in June and we will still be fine. I don't know what additional administrative burden it would have placed on INEC, because when you weigh both scenarios and situations, I thought that the trade-off would have been that if there is any administrative burden, that INEC bears the administrative burden and creates room, because this tight time frame for parties to conduct their primaries, to a large extent, was very, very cumbersome, especially given that we had a new provision that compels parties to submit the registers, and the failure to do so means you cannot field candidates. So the entire political system was put under pressure. And I thought that it would have been broad-based, the conversation around this. If I know our jurisprudence very well, the courts have always held and protected INEC's independence. And in this instant case, I think that is what the court will do, because there's already judicial precedent established in 3 other cases by the Supreme Court with respect to INEC's independence to issue, the timetables and guidelines.
But I mean, saying if you know our jurisprudence, and you should know, you're a lawyer, and you've been at this electoral civil society activism for decades now. But the trial court gave, a ruling. The 2 trial courts, in essence, gave rulings that were against INEC.
Well, INEC has appealed.
Exactly.
It's also filed for a stay of execution order. We don't know what date has been fixed, for hearing. And so there's confusion in the system at the moment. Because Justice Umar issued his ruling, then INEC issued a notice of appeal, and then Justice Omotosho issued his own ruling. Yes. Now the question is, what's the current state
of the jurisprudence?
Of the jurisprudence? Yes. It is confusing to me, but we can say that the latest judgment is the one that should be enforceable. But the latest judgment, if you look at it carefully, it upholds INEC's authority to issue the timetable. Yeah. And only talks about altering or changing the timetable where it conflicts with provisions, of the Electoral Act. So there's confusion in the system, and this is why we've always advocated that electoral laws should not be amended close to elections. And once you do that, you create this room, for confusion, and there's so much ambiguity as to what's the current state of play. And I don't think it's a good position for a country that is dealing with different manifestations of fragility to be at this particular point.
2 issues that have arisen in the past, since this ruling by Justice Umar, a couple of issues have arisen. One, there are many in the civic space who have questioned civil society organizations such as Yiaga, especially Yiaga being the leading face in this in the political civil society value chain. You are the leading, your organization is the leading. Why did they have to be the youth party that took this matter to court? Even listening to you here, I am hard pressed to find someone who is more knowledgeable, experientially, on all these issues of elections. That's why whenever I see you, on TV, I need to listen, because I know whatever I'm getting from, whatever I'm hearing from you is more or less like listening to the INEC chair. Why is it, Samson, can you tell us why didn't Yiaga Africa, once this Electoral Act was passed, why didn't Yiaga Africa, seeing all these gaps, all these loopholes, why didn't Yiaga Africa take this issue to court?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and thanks for those kind words. We need to understand the whole concept of locus. And locus simply means the right to institute an action in court.
Because the court will ask you, what do you stand to lose or benefit?
And the court, also, if you check, is the fact that the court has always held consistently, and it's an established principle of law, that if you don't have a right to institute any matter, then you have no business. In this instant case, the bigger question is civil society are not political parties. We don't participate in primaries. We don't field candidates in primaries. The bigger question is, are we a primary party in what? In such pre-election matter? My answer is actually, no, we're not. As the parties, because they are part of the process. It doesn't mean that civil society organizations cannot engage in public interest litigation, cannot engage in class action, especially when you want to challenge certain actions of the law. And there are people who have done this. I know of an organization that has challenged, some sections of the Electoral Act. Often, those matters could be public interest matters, as long as you're able to show sufficient prima facie or sufficient evidence that these will infringe on a right of citizens. So we can't do that. But in this particular case, it is the parties who are most affected, who are part of this process, who are fielding candidates that went to the court in this particular case. But we need to encourage this level of activism. And yes, there are organizations that are very much involved in strategic litigation. So I don't particularly agree that civil society isn't doing its work. We have to be gracious, to civil society, because there's also the condition for which they operate, and there are several limitations as well.
Okay. I said there are a number of issues. Second issue is, from all of this brouhaha, is what is INEC's interest, special interest in compressing the timelines, for nomination of candidates, submission of candidates? Because even you said here that, if primaries were held in June, you don't see, it's still well within the time frame, of the law and all of that. Now that INEC is saying they're going to go on appeal, why? That's some of the questions I'm getting from everywhere. What is INEC's special interest? Because some are making allusion to the fact that INEC is actually playing a script of the ruling party. What do you have to say to this? What is INEC's interest?
If you look at the 9 grounds in INEC's notice of appeal, you must look at this from different perspectives. And I'm responding to this question wearing different hats. First, is the heart of a citizen. Yeah. Second, is the heart of a lawyer. Thirdly, is a student of election law, and I've taught election law. And fourthly, as a civil society leader working in Yiaga Africa. When I combine these different hearts, I would say this: one, what INEC is trying to do is to protect its independence by filing for the appeal. And I don't see anything wrong with trying to protect your independence, because it's an established principle of law that INEC has its independence, and that independence needs to be protected. The second is, it's also an established principle of law that institutions have discretion. And what the Commission did was exercise its discretion. It needs to now establish that some of its actions do not run contrary, to the provisions, of the law. What I think should have been INEC's interest is to say that, one, few weeks ago, INEC, in the timetable, provided a specific date for submission of register of party members. The parties opposed and pushed back and said, no, that's not what the Act says. The Act says that parties shall submit their register of members 21 days before the date set for a primary. So it is not for INEC to tell political parties the date to conduct their primaries. And time starts counting from the date that they do what? Indicate their primaries. And INEC agreed with the parties and said, yes, you are right, because that's what the law actually says. INEC was wrong to say parties must submit their register of members on a particular date. Those kinds of interactions are interactions that we should encourage. And what I expect INEC to do is to look at, given this particular situation, is how do you engage with political parties to inspire trust and say that the commission as a regulator is not trying to shrink the space for other political parties. Because when the commission takes actions that appears it disproportionately impacts on other parties, rest assured that INEC's actions are going to be misread, by political parties. I have no evidence to establish that, yes, INEC is doing the bidding of the ruling party. But you see, in elections and in politics, perception is reality. And this is why INEC must, one, always be transparent. There's a reason why transparency is critical in election administration. Because if you open up your processes for people to see, then people would have no reasons to doubt your actions. INEC also needs to maintain some consistency in the decisions that it takes. Because when it takes a particular decision that varies from an earlier decision that is taken, it will be read as though it is responding to external forces. But I must also say that we cannot let political parties to regulate themselves. That you still need an institution. And INEC, as serving as a regulator, would need to take political parties into confidence, creating a level playing field for all, and ensuring that its actions does not disadvantage any particular political party. Because as far as the Constitution is concerned, as far as the Electoral Act is concerned, as far as the guidelines are concerned, all parties are equal before the law. All parties are equal before the law. Therefore, preferential treatment should not be given to any particular actor or political party. And let me make another example. You reference how the chairman of the ruling party reeled out figures of members contained in the voters' register. The big question is, how did he obtain those figures? And you see, maybe he used other means. Maybe it didn't come directly from the commission. But if INEC had proactively released those figures when it issued the statement about compliance, no one would have been asking questions about, is the ruling party being privileged than other political parties? These are actions, that cast doubts on the minds of people. And INEC needs to be very careful with some of the actions that it takes.
Let me ask you, before it escapes my mind, since we're on it right now, how does INEC verify and ascertain the authenticity of membership register of political parties?
I think first is what's the format provided by the law.
Yeah.
The 2026 Electoral Act clearly provides the format for party membership registers: name, gender, address, phone number, email, biometric features, and the national identity number. That was the new format. So the first test is all these registers were they submitted in the prescribed format provided by the law. If not, then that register is not valid. Now, we do not know as a public if there was compliance. All we know is that parties submitted their register. And this is where transparency also comes in. The second is, INEC can, using technology, because they are digital and hard copy registers that were submitted. The question is, did parties submit digital and hard copies as provided by the law? If the answer is in the affirmative, then INEC can verify and do what you call deduplication. If a party says they have 10 million, 15 million, 20 million, check the register to see, one, that there are no errors, that there are no multiple or double entry, and then publish your findings and your report. Secondly, you have to compare and analyze the registers and check if names are appearing on multiple registers. And this you can do using technology. Artificial intelligence can actually help you do that. When you combine and analyze all the registers, there are outlier detectors that you can actually find and see the trend and publish it, because the provision for submission of register of members is a novel one in the 2026 Act. We have to maximize, the benefits of that particular provision. And it's in these deduplication processes that are equally important. Now, at the moment, can INEC actually ascertain those who were accredited to vote at the party primaries
That was actually
for all
why I
the
raised
parties?
this question.
The answer is no. To the best of my knowledge, all the accreditation processes, I don't see how INEC actually monitored those accreditation processes, because one, they were not done electronically. I don't know if they were even done manually. All we saw was the counting. In some cases, the primaries did not even hold in those locations, but figures were produced.
When this Electoral Act 2026 was hurriedly passed by the National Assembly, there were whimpers here and there, from some of the leading political parties, calling for caution, and that let more due diligence be done on this act, But then before you could say, hey, they took it to the president. In 24 hours, it was signed. The law provides for, I'm not sure, you correct me if I'm wrong, maybe 30 days window that a bill is sent to the president for assent. He has 30 days window to either assent or reject assent and return it and all of that. It was hurriedly passed. Attorney General, they don't see it, who is his chief legal advisor. The parties didn't even have time to even go over it. Did we make a mistake in hurriedly passing the act?
I don't think it's a mistake. It's a miscarriage of justice. And it's unfair to the Nigerian people. Because the two committees in the National Assembly, whom I work closely with, and I was a member of the technical committee, I say that they started this reform process early. They did everything they could as a committee. I hope you know some of the insertions that are problematic and draconian were not on the reform agenda.
Absolutely.
They were included at the last minute.
Absolutely.
Because one man or two men or a group of the elite class decided to substitute public interest with their own interest. That is exactly what has landed us in this particular place. And you can see, the 2022 Act was one of the best pieces of legislation that we had. But I can't say that for the 2026 Act. It's the 2026 Act, I must say, is really regressive in every respect, despite some of the lofty innovations introduced in the Act. And so it's a miscarriage. It's an insult to the Nigerian people, and it clearly tells us that we have a political class that is not interested in credible elections. Because if they are interested in credible elections, they wouldn't alter the timetable. If they were interested in credible elections, they will not shorten the time frame that INEC, the time frame for releasing funds to INEC. You say 6 months, when the law in 2022 says 12 months. You shorten the time to 6 months, starving INEC of its funding. As we speak, INEC hasn't gotten most of its funding for the Ekiti elections. And we have raised this as civil society about the concerns that we have. Yes, you can say the budget was just passed, right? But one way to undermine an electoral commission is to not provide the funding. And so when you look across board, you really ask yourself, is there a commitment to credible elections? I just think that what the lawmakers did, not all of them, was to do what? To adjust the rules in a way that it guarantees political victory or electoral victory for a few. Because I don't see the reason why there was a proviso in Section 50 that deals with transmission of results. I see no reason why in Section 63 you say the only time INEC can activate its power to review results declared under duress or in contravention of the procedure established in the law is only when an INEC official files a report. What if that INEC official is the one who is complicit? Will they report themselves? So what then is the basis of having accredited party agents, accredited observers? What's the point? Because if you say an INEC official is the only one that must file a report before you review, then you clearly know that this entire system has been set up to deliver a particular outcome. And I say that for citizens, we have to rise up and be vigilant and read these rules, read the regulations and the guidelines, and ensure that we don't sit back and watch our collective destiny being stolen by a few people who are determined to perpetuate themselves in office.
Samson, let me put you on the spot. Did the political parties do enough to resist this perfidy in the name of this Electoral Act 2026? Did they do enough?
Quite frankly, I don't think they did enough. I think the political parties should feel ashamed. In the entire reform process, it was just civil society that was actively involved and engaged. And so when I see opposition parties actually scream at the dying minute, they could not even build consensus on issues. They could not even engage. They could not even mobilize their members to assert a pressure. And so you look at it, they were also docile because the provision for the submission of register was in the bill from the beginning of this entire process. The National Assembly committees had interactions with political parties. All the parties, with IPAC, they saw the provision. How come they didn't anticipate that this was going to be passed, and then they started putting their house in order? They saw the ruling party conducting e-registration. But the ruling party knew that this law was going to be passed. Everybody had access to that information. Any party in Nigeria that says they didn't know, they should not blame anybody, because the bill was there. Public hearings were held. They were there. The provisions that I know were not part of this was the one on electronic transmission of results. So I can excuse parties. The ones on the timelines, I can excuse parties. But the one on the register, on that particular issue, the parties slept over their rights. It was there. They saw it. They even had those documents. And so no party should say that they were not aware. They slept over their rights. And so no one should be blamed. They should blame themselves. Opposition parties should be very active in providing the vigilance that is required. But often, they abdicate that responsibility to civil society. We in civil society are not political parties. We don't contest, for political power. So parties should learn to do their job and not abdicate the responsibility to civil society.
In all the more than maybe about 2 decades now you've been involved in all of this, can you honestly, Samson, say that our political parties are actually political parties in the real sense of the word, in the frame of the ANC in South Africa? I mean, I'm not even going to go outside of the shores of Africa. Let's use the ANC. The oldest party in Africa, not in the world, but in Africa, 1925. That party has been there, 1925, till date.
Yeah.
Because a political party has different arms. They don't just, contest for elections. It's not just about contesting for, looking for candidates and contesting for elections. They educate the public. They have research and development. They have tech. Our political parties, because the prominent accusation against our political parties is that they don't have ideology. But beyond just not having ideology, do they have structures? Do they have systems that can stand the stress of the times?
I think the big problem with our political system is at the individual level.
Wow.
Until you have men and women of conscience with regard for ethics and values, there's no institutional arrangement that would withstand the pressures that come from individuals who are already morally bankrupt. And that's my conclusion, that people need to change their attitude. Because what you see in the parties is a reflection of a certain dysfunctionality and a defect in our values. Because if not, please, how can you explain that political parties or people who call themselves political associations have no regard for their own rules? They have no, their constitution says, prescribes what needs to be done. But do they follow their own rules? The answer is no. So in this climate, rules don't govern political parties. It is individual preferences that regulates political parties. You don't do that. In other climes, you reference the ANC. These are legacy parties. These were liberation movements that later morphed into political parties. In our own case, we have some of those legacy movements. NCNC,
Yes.
the
PRP.
PRP of this world, SDP as well.
Yeah.
But when you look at some of the parties that have emerged today, you really ask yourself, are they really political parties? So mine is not necessarily about the party structure and the system itself. It's the individuals. And until we get to a point where an individual who has been tried, who has been convicted, who stole public funds, does not secure nomination of a political party, then we can start having that conversation. Because how do you explain individuals who claim to have gone through a screening process of a political party? It makes a mockery of our entire democratic system, that we are a people that don't have values. And I refuse to accept that as a country and as a people, we don't have values. There have to be red lines. Or how do you explain that individuals who are not members of a party, but they are actually dictating what happens in those parties from outside, determining who are candidates in those parties? How do you explain a situation where an individual holds office in the National Assembly as a minority leader in the opposition party, but emerges as a governorship candidate in a different party? How did we get to this point? You think Nigerians are not watching? You think young people are not watching? They are watching these bad precedents that we are setting. And we claim that this is politics. This cannot be politics. The way the political class want to define politics and make it the norm is what we need to resist. And I think this is the struggle of our time. And as a generation, we've got to rise up and say no to this kind of politics, because it will not take Nigeria anywhere. The bigger question is, we have to hold a conversation as a people, and we need to make a determination, on whether we want to make progress in our democracy or we want to rethink our own democratic model. And it's this whole point about what kind of parties do we want to have.
What you just said now, Samson, many have ascribed as the reasons why the PDP especially found itself in this current quagmire.
Yeah.
When certain members went against party rules, clearly party rules, and they were left to their devices, as it were. And then reality has dawned on everybody. But I want to take you back to the issue of Chinda, the minority leader in the House that you referenced. Is there no way for this to be questioned, maybe taken to court, to get this aberration sorted out?
Well, if what I read on the news is true, then I think a matter has been instituted in court, and therefore he needs to come establish whether he had ceased to be a member of the party, and because he can no longer, if he's a candidate of the ruling party, then he can no longer hold the position. He should have left the position, a long time ago. And these are the kinds of development in our polity that reinforces the fact that we are now a society without red lines. And that is really unfortunate.
Another quick one I want to touch on before it skips my mind. The removal of the delegates' indirect primary system from this Electoral Act?
Yeah.
Was it a grave error? Because people accuse that system as being more heavily monetized, subject to money. But was it not better than this indirect that we're seeing now, this direct primaries that we're seeing, and that is so shambolic, so funny, laughable?
I think we must understand that as humans, first, we're not perfect beings.
Yes. Yeah.
We've got our impurities, and we also have our own challenges. That needs to be established. And that humans also make mistakes. So the fact that we are not perfect clearly means that every human activity cannot be perfect. And what I mean is, it doesn't matter the procedure that you adopt. There could be challenges. In other words, no system, no mode, right, is imbued, from capture or manipulation. The best you can do is to ensure that there are mitigation measures. We've always known direct and indirect primaries until late President Buhari pressured the National Assembly to introduce consensus. And that consensus was just to legitimize a practice that the political parties have always adopted. And that always produced imposition, of candidates. And so you had three procedures. In fact, the mode of primaries in the entire reform process was not on the agenda. It was at a dying minute. And I'm sure it's either one individual or the preference of a few individuals that, no, let's remove indirect primaries. Because it was there from the beginning of this process. And so now we are beginning to see, we're implementing it and we are learning. I will be shocked and surprised if indirect primaries is not returned, to the Electoral Act. But that also tells you the problem of our entire conception of electoral reforms. That year in, year out, we are changing laws because of the preferences of politicians and not what serves Nigeria's democracy and our collective interest. And that's why we will continue to amend these laws until we have a national conversation and consensus on what will be our reform priorities.
Now, Samson, you've interfaced with INEC for whenever, I don't know, the INEC starts, the name starts from independence. Is INEC actually independent? Be honest, Samson. Nigerians are watching you. Is INEC, in your mind, to your mind, is INEC truly, actually independent?
I'm always honest.
I want to believe so.
And Yiaga Africa has always been.
I want to believe so.
And we have said this consistently, that the Electoral Commission has always been captured by vested political interest. At Yiaga Africa, we developed the Election Manipulation Risk Index. And the goal was to track how political actors were capturing and manipulating the process before elections. And one way to do that is what? Is true capture of the election management body. Exactly. I have held this position constantly, that INEC's operational independence is not guaranteed because the president appoints the chair, the national commissioners, and the resident electoral commissioners. The president is the leader of a political party. And so my view, which is consistent with Justice Uwe's recommendations, and Yiaga Africa and a couple of civil society have held this view, that one way to liberate INEC is to remove this power from the president. The other thing is financial independence. Yes, INEC is funded from the Consolidated Revenue Fund, undoubtedly. But the question is, does INEC get all the monies that it needs for elections? The National Assembly in the 2026 Act reduced the time frame for release of INEC funding from 12 months to 6 months. Isn't that capture? If you check across board, you check the decisions of the Electoral Commission, we know for a fact how politicians try to influence appointments into the Electoral Commission. how they try to influence appointments of collation officers. We know for a fact. We've also seen instances where results were manipulated. We have said this at the INEC Africa. We've published it. We produced evidence. And I've said it publicly. It's only a captured electoral commission that will not hold every political actor to account. And so, yes, there are concerns about INEC's independence. INEC needs to demonstrate that it is independent by some of the actions. And there are a few things. One, the back end of the BVAS and the IREV, that needs to be subjected to public scrutiny. Secondly, is the whole point, about the technologies that we use for elections. How are those technologies being procured? Who is procuring them? From where? Do we have politicians who are card-carrying members of political parties serve as vendors for INEC? They are fundamental issues. You don't want to speak to an INEC chairman or even people in INEC to tell you how they put under pressure by politicians to award contracts to them. These things are in the public space and the public domain. So, yes, there are concerns about INEC's independence. But when you think, and I've said this repeatedly, that INEC's problem is not a technical problem. INEC has a political problem. It's the political interference with INEC's work and functions is what produces the kind of outcomes. Because INEC has advanced technically and professionally. And I tell you, having worked on elections across Africa, there are very few electoral commissions that can compete with INEC in terms of the technical competencies, in terms of the systems that INEC has in place, the technologies that INEC, a lot of electoral commissions across the world are learning from INEC. But our own problem is that the more INEC professionalizes, improves us on its technical competencies, the more intense the political interference with the commission.
Interesting. In 2014, civil society organizations took on President Goodluck Jonathan to be more democratic, to allow democratic ethos to thrive in Nigeria and all of that. The civil society organizations were on the streets, But in 2026, Samson, 2025, 2026, we've seen what the ruling party, the president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, and his ruling party, and his government, we've seen what they've done to opposition political parties. I'm stringing them, almost hollowing them out, as it were. Yeah. Initially, it was in the realm of conjecture, rumors, until the president jocularly was saying to Senate President, I will send you to the other side, scatter them. Okay, so that was a joke. But then we know that at leadership level, there's some things that you should not say, because people listening to you will take it, as a signal. And so his chief of staff went to Abijide's party to actually repeat the same thing, that, Abijide, don't leave that place, stay there, scatter them and all of that. Why is civil society quiet with President Tinubu? Why are you guys giving him a pass?
That is so untrue.
Okay.
That is false.
Debunk it.
I think that we need to understand how civil society works and how civil society functions. And I will give you classic examples of what civil society has done. But let me begin by how the state has also responded to civil society. Because the way we use civil society, we use it as a generic term, and we forget that it's not a homogeneous group. It's heterogeneous in every respect. You have government civil society. And today, you see all sorts of groups that have emerged, addressing all sorts of world press conferences, adopting and endorsing all sorts of things that are antithetical to democratic practice. Now, this is one of the challenges of liberal democracy. They are doing so. Yes, it's their right. They can do that because it's a democracy, right? But when you think about serious organizations, I don't think that civil society has gone to sleep. There are organizations that are involved in exposing the corruption in this government. We have organizations who are engaged in strategic litigation, holding and putting the fire in what? Under the feet of this current administration. In fact, in one instant case, a state institution also filed a matter. As you know, one of those organizations like SERAC, was sued.
Yep.
And the court ruled against SERAC. They've appealed.
Yep.
You want to talk about the issues around human rights? There, few weeks ago, over 50 organizations addressed a press conference on the state of the nation. And I mean reputed civil society organizations. It's there in the public space, where we raise concerns about judicial capture, about insecurity, about the economy, and then our gradual descent into authoritarianism. They are there in the public space. So civil society has not gone to sleep. You're talking about effective organizing. There have been several protests by different groups or different associations. The fact that you don't see prominent faces does not mean that civil society isn't actively involved.
Sorry to interrupt you, Samson.
Yeah.
Compare now to the days of Campaign for Democracy, Civil Liberties Organization, Nigerian Medical Association under Bekor and Subkuti, Nigerian Labour Congress, Pengasan, Nupeng under Frank Okori. Especially now, what's this body? I'm trying to remember this body, Why have we suddenly gone AWOL?
Well, you know what has happened. We need to take note of the disruptions that have happened in the civic space, and that the politics have also shifted, and the trends and the patterns clearly demonstrate different. You have Gen Zs today who are asking questions. And if you go online, you can see the level of organizing. NSAS was a direct product, of civic activism. And you see how young Gen Zs or Gen Zs are actively pushing the boundaries of public discourse. The Tinubu administration have had to reverse certain policies because of the pressure that came from young people and came from citizens. So if you're expecting to see the forms of organizing that was there 10 years ago, or a decade ago, or 2 years ago, no, the landscape have really shifted. Social media and technology is playing a key role in the way people are organizing. The issues have also done what? They've also shifted, as well. Even though government has also intensified its own capture of those institutions. But I dare say that when you look across board, we need to give credit to Gen Zs who are pushing the boundaries of engagement, and then civil society organizations who are also working at the state level. I know civil society organizations that, despite some of the funding challenges that has really occurred within the space, they're still standing tall and really making conversation and pushing the boundaries. The other point, you must also see that there's been a shifting role from the confrontational engagement to providing some level of technical assistance. And if you look across every agency of government, there's one civil society organization serving as a technical assistant, delivering technical assistance to those institutions. So those roles have shifted. But I think on the point about accountability, I agree with you to the extent that there's a great need to amplify the discourse on accountability. But it does not mean that organizations and civil society organizations haven't done it. Recently, there was a statement about missing persons and the state of security. Yeah, so civil society also has its own limitations, as well, because they talk and talk, we speak and speak. The politicians still do what they want to do. But I think on our part, we are taking lessons and understanding the context and mobilizing citizens. That's why we've been actively involved in the reform process. We've been actively involved in mobilizing citizens, and we are not going to stop.
Okay. Second to last question. There was a scandal that blew up in the face of Professor George Amokwita, INEC chair, concerning, where his loyalties or allegiance lay, People came up with evidence of 2023 tweets and all of that, Of course, it was not INEC chair in 2023, so he could support whoever he wants to support. Now going further to delete those tweets, to disassociate yourselves from this Twitter handle that apparently is linked to you, mobile email, mobile number, all of that. So, also, if you add the fact that from nowhere, a court of appeal gets a judgment, and then the INEC chair interpreted it to mean the end of use of the ADC was derecognized. They captated that. And should INEC chair Amokutan, should they resign? Is he a fit and proper person? That's the language you lawyers use. Is he a fit and proper person to be INEC chair?
I think the decision to resign is a personal decision that the INEC chair.
Do you have confidence in Professor George Amokutan?
Well, to a large extent, and I will come to that, but let me deal with the question about resignation. And I see people have made these calls about resignation. You see, elections and the acceptability of elections is built on trust. It's built on trust. And when the public does not trust the process, they will not accept the outcome. Unfortunately, this particular INEC has inherited a baggage of distrust, but has now also layered it with other actions that, put the whole confidence of citizens, at bay. And it's troubling. And so one thing is that if we're going to have credible elections, then the chair of INEC has to demonstrate to Nigerians that, one, he is not under any influence by those who appointed him, and he strongly upholds neutrality in the management of INEC and its affairs. And there will be several tests that will come. And we say the first test is the BVAS and the IREV. Can you subject it to public scrutiny? We want to know, because we have been told that you can tamper with the back end of the BVAS. In fact, some of the things that have happened could only have happened if someone tampered with the back end of the BVAS. So subject it to public scrutiny, BVAS and the IREV. The second is the regulations and guidelines for elections. Where are those regulations? We need to debate some of the proposals and provisions in that regulation to ensure that they inspire trust and confidence. The third is consistency in decision making. And if the commission deviates from actions that it has taken, it will lead to public distrust. The fourth one is the deployment of resident electoral commissioners. And I need to really flag this, because it was a standard policy of INEC that a resident electoral commissioner shall not manage 2 general elections, especially in a particular state. There were redeployments that were made recently. They were not announced. We didn't know. And that itself does not inspire trust and confidence. There are recs that we know wrecked elections in 2023. They have taken them back to those states. Why were they deployed back to those states? These kinds of developments does not inspire
Can you mention some of these recs?
I can say the rec for Rivers.
Rivers
is one, right? Look at the rec that managed the Edo elections. And look at what happened in the Edo elections. How come he was deployed to Akwa Ibom? The Akwa Ibom that we know very well, its own electoral history. There are some of these, movements that have been done. And I think that the commission needs to be careful in how it manages and takes decisions, because the public is watching. And if people don't trust INEC, then the 27% turnout that we saw in 2023 will be a child's play. People we will be recording somewhere even less than 20 in the next elections, especially with the way the primaries have gone, with all the things that we see. I personally doubt that we will see increased turnout. And that's not where we should be. Because if it's the Nigerians that we know that have told us in Yiaga Africa's National Voting Intention Survey, Nigerians are interested in voting. It's just that they don't trust the process.
2 questions, in the 2 minutes that we have left. Number one, if the 2027 elections, from everything we've said now, if it does not pan out, passing the test of fairness, justice, transparency, accountability, what's the civil society led by Yiaga Africa? Beyond, because what infuriates me about election cycles and civil society, after every botched elections that is littered with all sort of malpractice, you guys come up and issue these tepid, statements and all of that, just gets me really upset. Beyond issuing those tepid, statements, what are you willing to do? Mobilization of public to the streets, litigations, what are you willing to do? And then secondly, has our democracy improved in 27 years? Have we improved? Can we call ourselves a democracy in the truest sense of the word?
I don't know. I think you should be kind and fair to civil society because you don't know the conditions that we operate at work. And I don't think our reports and our statements are tepid in any respect. Well, maybe you're saying that because of maybe other civil society organizations who call themselves civil society organizations, but they are not necessarily civil society organizations. And you have to filter. But the credible organizations that I know who are involved in elections, the Yiaga Africa of this world, the Center for Democracy and Development, the International Press Center, Kimpact, the Nigerian Civil Society Situation Room, Clean Foundation, the Nigerian Women Trust Fund, the Center for Media and Society, TAF Africa. All of these organizations are reputed organizations, and I don't think their assessments of the elections can be questioned in any way because of the methodology that they use. But the space is saturated with all forms of civil society organization, and you see all sorts of names. A lot of them are actually funded by politicians. Some of them pander to the whims and caprices of politicians. So I wouldn't call those, like credible civil society organizations involved in this work. What will we do? Our expectation is that the rules will be obeyed and that politicians will comply by the provisions of the law, and that INEC will be transparent and diligent in managing the elections. But if the election does not meet the test, our duty is one of vigilance. We will not take our eyes off this process because that's what they want us to do. We will not be overwhelmed because that's what they want us to do. We will not lower the standards for measuring the elections. Whether the INEC chairman and its leadership are new, whether we have a new Electoral Act or we have compressed timelines, we will continue to hold all the institutions involved in the election governance architecture to higher standards. That's what we will do. I would not say what happens afterwards. Our expectation is that we don't get to that point. The point about our democracy. I think that the problem with Nigeria is not democracy. The problem with Nigeria is the type of democracy that we practice. And it's because you have individuals that have no regard for value and ethics, who have no regard for democratic principles. They've captured political power, and they are the ones ruling and not governing over us. That is the problem of our democracy. And unless and until we get those people out and sanitize our democratic process, it's not going to change. You will have all the institutions, but these institutions have been captured. The National Assembly cannot back. It can't even bite. It considers itself, as an extension of the executive. But checks and balances is an integral part of a constitutional democracy. You have a judiciary, these institutions. So we're not where we want to be. But democracy still remains the best form. However, our expectations must match our active engagement.
Nice place to anchor. Thank you so much, Samson Itodo.
Thanks.
It's been a pleasure having you.
Always a delight.
It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you
Great
very much.
conversation.
Thank
And I'm
you.
sure I'll see you again as we wind down to 2027.
Most definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.